My name is Dr. Madison Sterling, and if you had half the brain your sister has, maybe you wouldn't be such a drain on our retirement fund," was the last sentence my father ever spoke to me before he erased my existence from the Sterling family ledger. It was May 14th, 2019, a Tuesday that smelled of damp pavement and impending storms in Baltimore, Maryland. We were standing in the parking lot of a nondescript Royal Farms gas station off Key Highway, the neon yellow sign humming with a low-frequency buzz that seemed to vibrate inside my very teeth. My father, Richard Sterling, a man who measured human worth in compounding interest and social standing, didn't even look me in the eye when he spat those words. Instead, he reached into the cup holder of his pristine 2018 silver metallic BMW 5 Series and hurled a plastic cup of lukewarm $4.50 coffee at my feet. The lid popped off on impact, splattering dark, acidic liquid across my white Adidas Stan Smith sneakers, shoes I had bought with the meager remains of my work-study paycheck. The catalyst for this clinical execution of my character was sitting in the passenger seat of that BMW, watching through the tinted glass with an expression of practiced, tragic concern. My younger sister, Chloe, who was then a 21-year-old marketing major at a boutique liberal arts college, had just delivered a performance worthy of an Academy Award. She had spent the previous hour weaving a tapestry of lies, telling our parents that I had been summarily kicked out of Johns Hopkins School of Medicine for unethical behavior. She claimed I had been caught forging signatures on prescriptions for controlled substances to fund a secret lifestyle they knew nothing about. It was a fabrication so grotesque, so utterly divorced from my reality as a student who lived on black coffee and 4 hours of sleep in the Welch Medical Library, that I was momentarily paralyzed by the sheer audacity of it. But my parents didn't ask for my side. They didn't ask to see a transcript or a disciplinary letter. They didn't even allow me to open my mouth. To them, Chloe was the golden child, the emotional barometer of the family, and I was merely a high-maintenance investment that had just gone into default. Richard reached into the breast pocket of his tailored charcoal suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of heavy bond paper. He didn't hand it to me. He dropped it onto the coffee-stained pavement. It was a printed spreadsheet, meticulously detailed, totaling $84,200.16. Every cent they had invested in me, from my undergraduate housing to the occasional grocery allowance, was listed as a debt to be repaid. They told me to never call again, shifted the BMW into gear, and drove away, leaving me standing in a puddle of cheap coffee and shattered expectations. For 5 years, I was a ghost. I worked 3 jobs, slept on a mattress I found on a sidewalk, and clawed my way back into the graces of the academic board at Hopkins, proving my innocence through a grueling 2-year investigation that eventually exposed Chloe's digital forgery, though by then, the bridge to my parents was already ash. Now I am 34 years old. I am the Chief of Neurosurgery at one of the most prestigious Level 1 trauma centers in the country. I spend my days navigating the microscopic geography of the human brain, making millimetric decisions that determine whether a person wakes up as themselves or as a memory. My life is defined by the sterile scent of isopropyl alcohol, the rhythmic hiss of ventilators, and the cold, unwavering logic of the scalpel. But logic fled the room this morning when the double doors of the surgical suite swung open and the paramedics rushed in, a Jane Doe who had collapsed in a downtown Starbucks. When I looked down at the vitals monitor and then at the gray, convulsing face of the patient, the world narrowed until all I could see was the small, crescent-shaped birthmark behind her right ear. It was Chloe. The sister who had burned my world to the ground was now a mass of failing neurological signals, wheeled into my OR with a grade 4 glioblastoma, a terminal aggressive brain tumor that had already begun to liquefy the very brain my father had once praised so highly. I stood there, my hands already scrubbed, the latex of my size 6.5 surgical gloves snapping against my wrists with a sound like a gunshot. The irony was a physical weight in the room, thicker than the smell of the cautery pens. The surgical lights, a specialized LED array costing $300,000, illuminated every pore of her skin, every strand of her expensive salon-highlighted hair that was now being ruthlessly shaved away by a surgical tech. I am supposed to be the objective observer, the healer who sees only the pathology and not the person, but as I looked at the MRI scans displayed on the wall, the jagged, butterfly-shaped shadow consuming her frontal lobe, all I could hear was the splash of coffee on my shoes in 2019. The silence in the OR was heavy, broken only by the steady, mechanical beep of the anesthesia monitor. My senior resident, Dr. Aris, looked at me expectantly. He didn't know the woman on the table was the reason I had spent my 29th birthday crying in a laundromat. To him, she was just a high-stakes case, a surgical challenge. But I was looking at the woman who had stolen my graduation, my wedding, and 5 years of my parents' lives. I thought about the $84,000 I had eventually wired back to my father's brokerage account 3 years ago without a note or a return address, just a digital middle finger in the form of a bank transfer. I leaned over her, the magnifying loops on my glasses bringing her closed eyelids into sharp, hyper-realistic focus. Her skin looked sallow, the vibrant, manipulative girl replaced by a hollowed-out vessel of disease. The glioblastoma was a grade 4, the most lethal form of primary brain tumor, often referred to by surgeons as the Terminator. It doesn't respect boundaries. It infiltrates healthy tissue with microscopic tentacles, making complete surgical removal an impossibility. I knew, looking at the imaging, that even with my hands, the best in the state, her prognosis was measured in months, not years. As I signaled for the scalpel, a Model 10 stainless steel blade, I felt a tremor of something I hadn't felt in years, raw, unadulterated power. For 5 years, they had held the power of my reputation, my finances, and my family over my head. They had used their words to lobotomize my place in the world. And now, the physical manifestation of that betrayal was literally in my hands. The hospital's policy on treating family members is clear. I should have recused myself the moment I recognized her. But the trauma bay had been a chaotic blur, and by the time the identification was confirmed via her handbag, she was already under my care, her scalp prepped with betadine, the surgical field draped in sterile blue. I began the craniotomy, the high-pitched whine of the Midas Rex surgical drill filling the room as I created a window into her skull. Each vibration of the drill felt like a step back in time. I remembered the way my mother, Diane, had looked at me that day at the gas station, not with anger, but with a chilling kind of pity, as if I were a stray dog that had finally bitten the hand that fed it. She had clutched her Michael Kors handbag to her chest, the one I had bought her for her birthday the year before, and looked away while my father threw his tantrum. They hadn't checked on me when a hurricane hit Baltimore 2 months later. They hadn't called when I was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. They had replaced me with the lie Chloe had sold them, and they had bought it at full price. The bone flap was removed and placed in a sterile basin of saline. I used the Dura scissors to open the thick membrane protecting the brain, revealing the pulsating gray-pink surface of the cortex. And there it was. The tumor was a grotesque yellowish mass, angry and disorganized, pushing against the delicate structures that controlled her speech, her memory, and her personality. It was an invasive thief, much like Chloe herself had been. As I began the debulking process, using the ultrasonic aspirator to vaporize the tumorous tissue, I found myself wondering where my parents were at this exact moment. Were they sitting in their oversized colonial in West Hartford, sipping Pinot Grigio and talking about Chloe's latest fake achievement? Were they still proud of the daughter who was currently having her skull hollowed out by the daughter they had discarded? The precision required for this surgery is exhausting. You are working in a space where a fraction of a millimeter is the difference between a patient who can say, "I love you," and one who can only stare at the ceiling. I moved the suction tip with the grace of a concert pianist, clearing away the necrotic center of the mass. Every few seconds, the irrigator would splash sterile water into the cavity, a rhythmic sound that reminded me of the rain on the BMW's windshield 5 years ago. I was saving her life, or at least extending it, providing her with the mercy she had never shown me. I was being the professional they said I couldn't be, the success they claimed I would never become. But the hyper-realism of the moment was almost too much to bear. I could see the individual capillaries on the surface of her brain, the way they throbbed with every heartbeat. I could hear the rhythmic clicking of the CO2 monitor. I noticed the way the surgical nurse, a woman named Sarah who had worked with me for 3 years, adjusted the overhead light to eliminate a shadow near the basal ganglia. Everything was sharp, cold, and undeniably real. There was no room for the messy, emotional girl who had been kicked out of her own family. There was only the Chief of Neurosurgery, performing a miracle on a monster. As I reached the deeper margins of the tumor, where the malignant cells began to weave into the vital motor tracts, I paused. This was the moment of decision. To push further was to risk her ability to move, to speak, to ever lie again. To stop was to leave behind seeds of a cancer that would surely return within weeks. I looked at the monitor, at her heart rate, a steady 72 beats per minute. She was entirely dependent on me. My name is Dr. Madison Sterling, and for 34 years I have been defined by what others took from me. But standing in this OR, under the glare of industrial lights and the weight of 1,000 unspoken grievances, I realized that I was finally the one in control of the narrative. The scalpel doesn't lie, and the brain doesn't keep secrets. By the time I finish this closing suture, the truth of who we both are will be written in the recovery room records, and for the first time in 5 years, I won't be the one who has to explain myself to anyone. Family is a complicated architecture of blood and bone, but in the end, we are all just a series of electrical impulses and the choices we make when the world is watching. Chloe made her choice in a gas station parking lot. Now, it was time for me to make mine. The contrast over those 5 years was not just a difference in lifestyle, it was a sickening, visceral manifestation of a moral bankruptcy that permeated the very roots of the Sterling family tree. While I was rebuilding my existence from the literal dirt upward, the world seemed to reward the very treachery that had discarded me. I found myself at Mount Sinai in New York City, working brutal, soul-crushing 100-hour weeks as a surgical resident, and then a fellow, a schedule that blurred the lines between day and night until my entire reality was reduced to the fluorescent hum of hospital corridors and the metallic tang of dried blood. I lived in a 410-square-foot basement apartment in Astoria, a cramped subterranean box where the ceiling height was so low I felt the weight of the entire building pressing down on my shoulders every morning. The rent was $1,700 a month, an exorbitant sum for a space where the heating system, an ancient and clanking iron radiator, predictably failed every January during the coldest Arctic blasts. I remember nights where the temperature inside dropped to 42 degrees, and I would sleep in my winter coat. my breath blooming in white clouds under the dim glow of a flickering 20-watt bulb. I wore $12 generic scrubs I bought in bulk from a discount medical supply warehouse, the fabric so thin and abrasive it felt like sandpaper against my skin after a 24-hour shift. My culinary existence was a repetitive cycle of 90-cent packets of instant noodles, seasoned with the salt of my own exhaustion, because every single spare penny was funneled into a high-yield savings account destined for my father's pocket. I was obsessed with paying off that $84,200 debt, plus the 6% interest I had calculated to match the market rate he so adored, because I refused to owe that man a single breath of my life. Meanwhile, Chloe, who was 37 and basking in the unearned glow of my parents' unwavering adoration, had become the undisputed star of the Sterling galaxy. While I was dodging cockroaches in my basement and scrubbing in for emergency craniotomies at 3 a.m, she was living a life of curated, high-end perfection in a $1.2 million colonial mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. Her home was a sprawling monument to the family's vanity, featuring manicured boxwood hedges and a wraparound porch that looked like it had been lifted directly from the pages of Architectural Digest. She didn't drive just any vehicle. She piloted a 2023 Alpine White BMW X7 with a monthly lease payment of $1,100. A sum that was nearly 2/3 of my entire monthly rent. I knew these details because, in a moment of masochistic weakness during my rare breaks, I would scroll through her public social media profiles, watching the life she had built on the ruins of mine. She posted endless reels of family dinners at the big mahogany table in Greenwich, the very table where I used to do my homework and dream of becoming a healer. In every photo, my absence was not just a void, it was a deliberate, staged replacement. My specific chair at the end of the table, the one I had occupied for 24 years, had been physically removed and replaced by a $3,000 decorative fern in a hand-painted Italian terracotta pot. It was as if they were trying to grow something living and green in the space where I had been buried. A silent testament to the fact that I had been successfully replaced by a piece of expensive vegetation. The psychological toll of this erasure was a constant, dull ache that sat right behind my sternum. I remember one specific Thanksgiving in 2021 when the radiator in my basement had given a final dying hiss and the temperature was plummeting. I sat on my lumpy secondhand mattress, eating a lukewarm cup of noodles, watching a video Chloe had posted. The video featured my father, Richard, carving a 20-pound organic turkey while my mother, Diane, laughed in the background, her wrist heavy with a new diamond tennis bracelet that probably cost more than my entire medical school tuition for a semester. They looked happy. They looked light. There was no shadow of the daughter they had cast out, no hesitation in their voices, and no flicker of doubt in their eyes. Chloe caught my father's attention in the video, whispering something that made him chuckle and pat her hand, the same hand that had forged the documents to destroy me. She was the golden girl, the marketing executive who made things happen, while I was the unethical failure they never spoke of. The injustice of it felt like a physical toxin in my blood, a bitter bile that I had to swallow every single day just to keep functioning. I channeled that rage into my work, becoming the most precise, most tireless, and most formidable surgeon in the department. I didn't just want to be a doctor anymore. I wanted to be a god of the operating room, a woman so successful that my name would eventually be a headline they couldn't ignore, a shadow they couldn't escape. Every month, like clockwork, I would send a digital transfer to my father's brokerage account. I never included a message. I never called to confirm receipt. I simply watched the balance of my debt dwindle from $84,000 to $60, then $40, then $20. I worked extra shifts in the ICU, took on grueling research projects that paid small stipends, and denied myself every luxury, from a new pair of shoes to a decent cup of coffee. I calculated the 6% interest with the precision of a forensic accountant, ensuring that when the final payment was made, there would be no legal or moral hook left in my flesh. I was buying my freedom one 90-cent meal at a time. The physical toll was evident. I lost weight. The dark circles under my eyes became permanent fixtures of my face, and my hands, though steady in surgery, would often shake with fatigue the moment I stepped out of the hospital. But the mental fortress I built was impenetrable. I lived in a world of technical manuals, neurological pathways, and the cold, hard data of patient outcomes. I stopped being Madison, the daughter who wanted to be loved, and became Dr. Sterling, the machine that could resect a tumor with more accuracy than a robot. Chloe's life, by contrast, seemed to be an endless parade of superficial triumphs. She traveled to the Amalfi Coast, posting photos of $30 cocktails against a backdrop of azure water. She attended charity galas in Manhattan, wearing silk gowns that cost $5,000, likely paid for by the consulting fees my father's company funneled to her for work she never actually performed. She was the ultimate beneficiary of a system built on nepotism and lies, a woman who had never known the sting of a cold radiator or the humiliation of splattered gas station coffee. Every time I saw her smiling face on my screen, I felt a surge of a very specific kind of resolve. I wasn't just surviving, I was waiting. I didn't know for what, but I knew that the universe has a way of balancing the scales, even if it takes years of silence and darkness to get there. I had become a master of the long game. I lived in my 400-square-foot basement, and I planned for a future where I wouldn't just be a drain on a retirement fund, but the person who determined whether that fund even mattered. The sheer audacity of her family posts was what stung the most. She would write captions like, "Grateful for the people who always stand by you," or "Family is everything," knowing full well that she had engineered the permanent exile of her only sibling. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. She had convinced my parents that I was a criminal, a drug seeker, and a disgrace, and she played the part of the concerned, grieving sister so well that they probably felt they were the ones who had been wronged. My father's pride was his greatest weakness, and Chloe knew exactly how to weaponize it. She made my failure a stain on his reputation that only her success could wash away. And so, the Sterling household became a closed loop of mutual delusion, with Chloe at the center, holding the remote to their reality. I was the ghost in the machine, the glitch they had successfully deleted. But ghosts have a way of haunting the living, and as I stood in that OR 5 years later, looking at the tumor eating through the brain that had masterminded my downfall, I realized that the debt wasn't just $84,000. The debt was 5 years of my life, 5 winters of freezing cold, and 1,000 meals of instant noodles. And today, the interest was finally due. I looked at the white BMW X7 parked in the hospital's VIP lot earlier that morning. I had recognized the vanity plate Chloe 1 immediately. She was still driving the latest model, still living the life of a princess, but as I stood over her open skull, all the leather upholstery and Greenwich zip codes in the world couldn't save her from the biology of her own cells. The grade 4 glioblastoma didn't care about her lease payments or her $3,000 fern. It was an equalizer of the most brutal kind. My father had once told me I didn't have half the brain she had, and now, ironically, I was the one tasked with trying to salvage what was left of it. The precision of my movements was a direct result of the hardship I had endured. The basement apartment had taught me resilience. The debt had taught me discipline. The noodles had taught me the value of every single resource. I was a surgeon forged in the fire of their rejection, and as I maneuvered the micro-scissors around her optic nerve, I felt a cold, crystalline clarity. I wasn't doing this for her, and I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it because I was the only person in the world who could. I was the investment they had written off, and now I was the only thing standing between the golden child and the morgue. The silence of the OR was the only answer I needed to the 5 years of noise they had made in my absence. This was the hyper-realism of my life, the scalpel, the tumor, and the heavy, undeniable truth that the drain on the retirement fund was now the one holding the power of life and death in her $12 scrub-clad hands. The absolute peak of this orchestrated betrayal occurred on June 19th, 2021, at the wedding of my cousin Sarah, an event held at the opulent Ashford Estate in the rolling hills of northern New Jersey, a venue where the baseline cost for a Saturday evening reception was a staggering $250 per plate. I had spent weeks agonizing over whether to attend, knowing that my presence was likely unwanted, but feeling a desperate, lingering need to reconnect with the extended family that had once been my world. I had scoured every thrift store in Queens until I found a simple navy blue sheath dress for $40, which I meticulously hemmed by hand in my basement apartment under a flickering lamp, trying to ignore the fact that the fabric was slightly pilled and smelled faintly of mothballs despite 3 washes. When I arrived at the estate, steering my rusting 2009 Toyota Corolla, a car with 214,000 miles on the odometer and a persistent rattle in the heat shield, into a parking lot filled with late-model Land Rovers and Mercedes-Benzes, I felt like a splinter under the skin of a polished hand. I walked toward the grand ballroom, the air thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and expensive perfume, clutching a small, handwritten card for Sarah that contained $50 I truly couldn't afford to give. As I reached the arched mahogany entrance to the ballroom, where a tuxedoed attendant stood next to a silver platter of champagne flutes, my mother, Beatrice, materialized like a ghost of my own failures to block my path. She was wearing a floor-length gown of champagne silk that must have cost $3,000, her neck adorned with the pearls my father had given her for their 30th anniversary. But her eyes were cold and sharp as surgical steel. She stepped forward, physically obstructing the doorway, and as she leaned in, I could smell the sharp, botanical scent of expensive Tanqueray No. 10 gin on her breath, a stark contrast to the sterile hospital soap that seemed permanently etched into my own pores. "The dropout isn't on the guest list, Madison," she whispered. The words hissed with such venom that they felt like a physical blow to my chest, and she didn't even have the decency to look ashamed as she adjusted her diamond earring with a manicured hand. Behind her, Chloe stood like a triumphant sentinel, draped in a bespoke emerald green cocktail dress that hugged her frame perfectly, her hand raised deliberately so the light from the crystal chandeliers would catch the fire in her 3-carat VVS1 Clarity diamond engagement ring. She didn't say a word, but she didn't have to. She simply let out a short, melodic laugh that echoed against the marble floors, a sound of pure, unadulterated mockery that told me she had personally seen to it that my name was scrubbed from the seating chart. The most devastating moment, however, wasn't my mother's cruelty or Chloe's silent derision, but the sight of my father, Richard, standing just a few feet away near the open bar. I caught his eye for a fleeting second, a moment where I hoped against all hope that he would see his daughter, the girl he used to take for ice cream after every science fair, and stand up for the truth. Instead, He looked away with a grimace of profound embarrassment, reaching up to adjust the knot of his $400 Ferragamo silk tie as if the fabric were choking him. And then he turned his back to me entirely to engage in a hollow conversation about the stock market with a distant uncle. No one stood up for me, not a single person in that room full of blood relatives who had watched me grow up. And the realization that I was truly, legally, and emotionally dead to them settled into my bones with a freezing finality. I turned around without saying another word, my heels clicking hollowly on the stone steps as I retreated from the warmth and the music and the laughter of a life I was no longer permitted to lead. The sky had opened up by the time I reached the parking lot, a torrential June downpour that soaked through my $40 dress in seconds, turning the navy blue fabric into a heavy, cold weight that clung to my skin like a shroud. I got into my 2009 Corolla, the door groaning on its hinges, and sat there in the darkness while the rain hammered against the thin metal roof with a deafening, percussive roar. The interior of the car smelled strongly of damp upholstery and the faint, lingering scent of the fast food coffee I lived on. A smell that was suddenly the only thing keeping me conscious and grounded in a world that felt like it was dissolving into gray water. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white and my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and exhaustion, watching the blurred lights of the Ashford estate in my rearview mirror. I realized then that they hadn't just kicked me out of the family. They had attempted to erase the very memory of my existence to keep their own polished image untarnished by the messiness of the truth. My mother had looked at me as if I were a stain on her gown, and my father had looked at me as if I were a bad debt he had finally managed to write off. And Chloe had looked at me with the predatory satisfaction of a person who had successfully stolen a life and was now wearing it like a trophy. I sat in that car for nearly an hour, the windows fogging up until the world outside was nothing but a smear of distorted colors, and I made a silent, solemn vow to the damp fabric of my driver's seat. I promised myself that I would never again seek a seat at a table where I wasn't wanted, and that I would build a life so formidable, so undeniably successful, that they would one day find themselves begging for the very presents they had just discarded. I thought about the $84,000 I was still paying off, the 90-cent noodles in my cupboard, and the $12 scrubs waiting for me at Mount Sinai, and I felt a cold, hard diamond of resolve form in the center of my chest. They wanted a dropout, so I would become a legend. They wanted a disgrace, so I would become a savior. The rain continued to lash against the windshield, a relentless New Jersey storm that washed away the last lingering traces of my childhood loyalty, leaving behind only the clinical, dispassionate ambition of a woman who had nothing left to lose. The drive back to my basement apartment in Astoria took 3 hours through the blinding rain and the heavy Saturday night traffic. Every mile a grueling reminder of the distance I had traveled from the person I used to be. My wet dress bled blue dye onto my skin, staining my thighs a bruised, ghostly color that wouldn't wash off for days, and the heater in the Corolla struggled to clear the mist from the glass. I felt like a refugee in my own life, a woman caught between a past that had betrayed her and a future that hadn't yet arrived. When I finally walked through the door of my 400-square-foot subterranean box, I didn't cry. Instead, I took off the ruined dress, threw it into the trash can next to my cracked laminate desk, and opened my neurosurgery textbook. The diagrams of the human brain, the intricate web of the circle of Willis, the delicate folds of the hippocampus, the unforgiving architecture of the brainstem, were the only things that made sense to me anymore. I studied until the sun began to rise over the Queensboro Bridge, my mind focused on the microscopic margins of error that defined my new reality. While 40 miles away in Greenwich, my family likely toasted to a wedding I was never meant to see. Now, as I stand in the OR in 2024, the memory of that damp upholstery and the smell of my mother's gin is as vivid as the surgical field in front of me. I look at Chloe, whose 3-carat ring was stripped off in the pre-op bay and placed in a plastic biohazard bag for safekeeping, and I see the ultimate irony of our shared history. The sister who blocked the door to a ballroom now has a tumor blocking the pathways of her own consciousness. The mother who called me a dropout is currently pacing the waiting room, clutching a styrofoam cup of hospital coffee that costs $2. Her expensive silk gown replaced by a wrinkled trench coat, and the frantic desperation of a parent about to lose her favorite child. The father who looked away from me is now staring at the double doors of my surgical suite, praying to a God he only remembers in emergencies that the Chief of Neurosurgery, the daughter he discarded, is as brilliant as the hospital's website claims she is. I am no longer wearing a $40 thrift store dress. I am wearing a custom-fitted lead apron and sterile antimicrobial scrubs that represent 15 years of unrelenting, agonizing labor. I am no longer sitting in a rusting Corolla in the rain. I am standing in a $60 million surgical theater, surrounded by a team of highly trained professionals who move at my command. The hyper-realism of this moment is almost overwhelming. The way the surgical suction gurgles as it removes the last of the necrotic tumor tissue, the sharp, ozone-like smell of the bipolar cautery, the rhythmic, electronic heartbeat of the woman who tried to destroy me. I work with a cold, surgical detachment, my hands moving with a precision that borders on the supernatural, because I know that my revenge isn't in failure, but in being better than they ever thought possible. I am saving Chloe not because I love her, and not because I have forgiven her, but because my integrity as a surgeon is the one thing they can never take away, and because I want her to wake up and see exactly who it was that pulled her back from the edge of the grave. As I begin the process of closing her dura with 4 0-neuralon sutures, each stitch a perfect equidistant knot, I think about that $250 plate of wedding food I never got to eat. I think about the gin on Beatrice's breath and the silence in my father's eyes. They thought they were protecting their guest list from a failure, but all they did was ensure that when they finally needed a hero, the only one available was the ghost they had created. The damp upholstery of that Corolla taught me more about survival than their Greenwich mansion ever could. And as I tie the final knot, I realize that the entrance I was blocked from 3 years ago was never the one that mattered. The only door that matters is the one I am about to walk through to tell my parents that their golden child is alive, and that the bill for her life is far higher than $84,000. It is a bill that will be paid in the currency of their pride every day for the rest of their lives, as they look at me and remember the night they left their only biological hope standing in the rain. That night, after the rain had finished its relentless assault on the Ashford estate, and the blue dye from my thrift store dress had stained my skin like a permanent bruise, I found myself sitting in a dimly lit, 24-hour diner called the Silver Star, located just off Route 17 in New Jersey. The air in the diner was thick with the heavy, comforting scent of overcooked bacon grease and industrial-strength floor cleaner, a stark contrast to the notes of expensive gin and jasmine that had defined my mother's betrayal only hours earlier. I sat in a cracked vinyl booth that hissed as I shifted my weight, the fluorescent light above my head flickering with a rhythmic, mechanical hum that seemed to sync with the throbbing ache in my temples. I didn't cry because tears felt like an indulgence I could no longer afford, a luxury for people who still had something left to lose. whereas I felt as though I had finally been hollowed out and replaced with something cold, metallic, and incredibly precise. I ordered a single cup of black coffee for $2, a bitter, scalding liquid served in a heavy ceramic mug that had seen decades of use, and I clutched it with both hands just to feel the heat seeping into my frozen fingers. I pulled my battered 2015 MacBook Air from my backpack, its aluminum casing scratched and dented from years of being shoved into hospital lockers and cramped library bags, and I waited for the glowing Apple logo to illuminate the darkness of the booth. With a few keystrokes, I navigated to my Chase Bank mobile app, and there it was, the digital reality of my exile, $12.14. That was the entirety of my liquid net worth, the sum total of what remained after paying the latest installment of the $84,200 debt my father had weaponized against me. I stared at those digits for a long time, the decimal point appearing like a period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. But then, I closed that tab and opened my internal hospital portal, navigating to the password-protected dashboard that tracked my performance metrics at Mount Sinai. I looked at my surgical statistics, the cold, hard data that no one in Greenwich could forge or lie about. A 98% success rate across 342 assisted and primary procedures, including some of the most complex neurosurgical interventions the department had seen in a decade. I realized in that moment, as the steam from my $2 coffee curled toward the yellowed ceiling tiles, that blood isn't a bond or a sacred covenant. It is merely a biological liquid, a suspension of red cells, white cells, and plasma that we study under microscopes in clinical labs. It carries oxygen and nutrients. It clots when there is a wound, and it can be analyzed for DNA, but it has no inherent capacity for loyalty, love, or truth. My family shared my blood type, but they didn't share my soul, and the genetic markers that linked us were nothing more than a chemical coincidence. The realization was liberating, a crystalline moment of clarity that shattered the last of my childhood delusions. I reached across the table and grabbed a coarse white paper napkin from the chrome dispenser, and with a black ballpoint pen that felt like a surgical tool in my hand, I wrote 3 words that would redefine the rest of my life: Sterling Medical Group, Phase 1. I decided then and there that I was finished trying to be a daughter to people who viewed me as a liability, and I was finished seeking a seat at a table that was intentionally built to exclude me. I was going to stop being a victim of their narrative and start becoming a legend in my own right, a woman whose name would carry more weight in the halls of medicine than my father's ever did in the boardrooms of Connecticut. Phase 1 of the Sterling Medical Group was not about fancy offices or high-end branding. It was about the brutal, uncompromising acquisition of skill and the total elimination of my former self. I looked at that napkin and saw a blueprint for a fortress. I would become the person they couldn't ignore, the specialist they would eventually have to beg for, and the authority that would make their social standing look like the shallow, fragile thing it was. The hyper-realism of my situation became my greatest asset. I didn't need the $3,000 decorative fern or the $1.2 million colonial house because I had something far more valuable, an intimate understanding of the human brain and the steady hands required to repair it. I watched the clock on the diner wall, a circular plastic timepiece with a red second hand that swept forward with relentless indifference. And I knew that every second spent wallowing was a second I wasn't using to build my empire. I spent the next 4 hours in that booth, using the diner's spotty Wi-Fi to research private practice structures, medical billing codes, and the procurement of surgical robotic systems, my $12 bank balance feeling less like a cage and more like a starting line. The waitress, a woman named Martha, whose name tag was slightly crooked and who smelled of menthol cigarettes, came by to refill my coffee 3 times, never asking why a woman in a damp navy blue dress was staring at a laptop in the middle of the night. She saw the intensity in my eyes and gave me the space that people give to something they don't quite understand. By 4 a.m., the napkin was covered in detailed notes about malpractice insurance, credentialing, and the specific patient demographics of the tri-state area. I was mapping out a future where the name Sterling would no longer be associated with Richard's manufacturing plant or Chloe's fake marketing successes, but with a standard of excellence that was untouchable. I was building a world where the only thing that mattered was the precision of the cut and the survival of the patient. I felt a surge of adrenaline that no amount of caffeine could provide, a deep, resonant sense of purpose that made the basement apartment in Astoria and the 90-cent noodles feel like the necessary training for a champion. I thought about Chloe's 3-carat ring and the way it had sparkled under the wedding chandeliers, and I realized that her wealth was borrowed, a fragile gift from a father who could take it away just as easily as he had taken my tuition. My wealth, however, was being forged in the fire of my own intellect and the muscle memory of my hands. It was mine, and it was permanent. When I finally closed my MacBook and walked out of the diner, the rain had stopped, leaving the asphalt of Route 17 shimmering with a dark, oily light. I got back into my 2009 Corolla, the engine turning over with a tired groan, and as I pulled onto the highway, I didn't look back at the Ashford estate. I looked forward, into the gray, pre-dawn light of the city, toward the hospital where I would spend the next 72 hours proving that I was exactly what they said I wasn't. The smell of damp upholstery was still there, but it no longer felt like the scent of failure. It felt like the smell of the ground before a harvest. My transformation was not overnight, but it was absolute. I stopped checking Chloe's social media. I stopped waiting for my mother's birthday to send a card that would never be acknowledged. I stopped hoping for a phone call that would never come. Every time I stepped into the operating room, I whispered the words Phase 1 to myself, a silent mantra that reminded me that every successful surgery was another brick in the wall of my new life. I became known in the hospital for my cold demeanor, a reputation for being unshakable and perhaps a bit distant. But what they didn't see was that I was simply operating on a different frequency. I was no longer a person seeking connection. I was a surgeon seeking perfection. The 98% success rate became 99%. My fellowship ended, and I was offered a position that most people spend 20 years chasing. I accepted it not for the prestige, but for the leverage it gave me to finally begin Phase 2. The contrast between my reality and the life I had left behind was now a source of strength rather than sorrow. I knew that while they were playing at family and prestige, I was mastering the very essence of life and death. I knew that one day the biological reality of their existence would catch up with the lies they had told, because nature is the ultimate auditor. And when that day came, I wouldn't be the dropout in the thrift store dress. I would be the legend they were forced to acknowledge. As I drove toward Astoria, the sun began to peek over the Manhattan skyline, hitting the glass of the skyscrapers with a blinding golden light. It was a new day, and the Sterling Medical Group was no longer just a note on a napkin. It was a heartbeat, steady and strong, pulsing with the silent, unstoppable force of a woman who had finally learned that the only person who can truly define your worth is the one you see in the mirror when the world is dark and the coffee is black. Now, as I close the craniotomy on my sister 5 years later, the weight of that night in the diner feels like a distant dream, yet its lessons are etched into every move I make. I am the Chief of Neurosurgery, and the Sterling Medical Group is a reality that dominates the regional medical landscape. I am no longer a drain on a retirement fund. I am a woman who generates more revenue in a single quarter than my father's plant did in a year. But more importantly, I am a woman who knows the difference between a liquid in a lab and the bonds that are built through sacrifice and truth. I have become the legend I promised that girl in the diner she would be, and as I step away from the table and hand the closing duties to my resident, I feel a sense of completion that has nothing to do with the surgery and everything to do with the napkin. I have survived the rain. I have survived the silence, and I have survived the Sterling family. I am Dr. Madison Sterling, and the story I am writing now is one that no one else gets to edit. The debt is paid, the truth is out, and the legend is only just beginning. I spent the next 3 years of my life meticulously building what I came to call my arsenal, a digital and physical fortress of truth designed to withstand the inevitable collapse of the Sterling family's house of cards. While I was ascending the ranks of the surgical world, becoming a ghost with a scalpel who haunted the corridors of the city's most prestigious hospitals, I was also moonlighting as a forensic architect of my own vindication. I realized early on that my word would never be enough for a man like Richard Sterling, who worshipped at the altar of documented proof, so I decided to speak his language with a fluency that would eventually leave him speechless. I took a significant portion of my first real surgeon's salary, the kind of money that made the 90-cent noodles of my past feel like a distant, bad dream. And I hired a high-end private investigator named Elias Thorne, handing him a $5,000 retainer in cash to begin tracking the intricate web of Chloe's supposed business success. Elias was a man who specialized in the shadows of the wealthy, and he spent months peeling back the layers of Chloe's curated life in Greenwich, following the money trail that led away from her failing boutique marketing firm and straight into the heart of our parents' personal finances. The truth that Elias unearthed was more grotesque and more poetic than I could have ever imagined in my darkest moments of resentment. Chloe wasn't just the favorite child. She was a parasite who had been systematically draining the very retirement fund my father had once accused me of depleting. The detailed reports Elias provided showed a consistent, calculated pattern of embezzlement totaling exactly $214,000 over the span of 4 years. She had been forging my father's signature on digital transfers and skimming off the top of their investment dividends to fund her white BMW X7 lease, her designer wardrobe, and the appearance of a thriving career that was actually nothing more than a hollow shell. I kept every single one of these bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and forged authorization letters in a $1,200 SentrySafe commercial fireproof safe that I bolted to the floor of my new home office. That safe became the tabernacle of my survival, containing not just the evidence of Chloe's crimes, but the hard-won trophies of my own transformation. Alongside the records of her betrayal, I kept the pristine, embossed original of my medical license and my board certifications, documents that represented thousands of hours of agonizing study and clinical perfection. I also kept a signed copy of the $1.4 million annual salary contract I had recently inked with the city's top surgical center, a document that proved I was now one of the highest paid and most sought-after neurosurgeons in the entire tri-state area. I would often sit in front of that open safe late at night, the heavy steel door swinging wide on its oiled hinges, and I would compare the two piles of paper. On one side was the evidence of a woman who had stolen to stay afloat, and on the other was the evidence of a woman who had built an empire from the ashes of her own reputation. I was a ghost with a scalpel, a woman who had been erased by her family, but who was now more real, more powerful, and more dangerous than any of them could possibly comprehend. The hyper-realism of my double life was intoxicating. By day, I was the clinical authority in the OR, navigating the microscopic margins of the human brain with a precision that bordered on the divine. And by night, I was the silent observer of my family's slow-motion train wreck. Elias would send me updates on encrypted servers, photos of Chloe meeting with investors who were actually just high-interest lenders, and screenshots of my mother's dwindling savings accounts that she was too distracted by her expensive gin and social calendar to notice. I watched from the shadows as the $3,000 decorative fern in the Greenwich house likely witnessed more lies in a single evening than I had told in my entire 34 years. I felt no pity as I saw the numbers on the spreadsheets climb, because every dollar Chloe stole was another nail in the coffin of the daughter they thought they had. I was waiting for the perfect surgical moment to make the incision, the moment when the pressure would be at its highest and the truth would have the maximum impact. My apartment was no longer a 400-square-foot basement. It was a sprawling, minimalist loft in Soho with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city I had conquered. I wore $600 Italian leather shoes and carried a stethoscope that cost more than my entire wardrobe from my residency years. But I never forgot the cold of that January in Astoria. The memory of the $84,200 bill my father had dropped on the pavement was the fuel that kept my engine running at a lethal temperature. I had become a master of patience, a skill I honed during 12-hour surgeries where a single slip of the hand meant catastrophe. I knew that if I revealed Chloe's theft too early, my father would find a way to rationalize it, to protect his golden child and his own ego. I had to wait until the situation was terminal, until they had no choice but to see the rot for what it was. I was documenting their downfall with the same clinical detachment I used to map a glioblastoma, noting every symptom of their impending collapse. In the safe, the mountain of evidence grew until the folders were thick and heavy, a physical manifestation of the justice that was coming. I had copies of the emails she sent to my parents, filled with fake profit and loss statements for her business, juxtaposed with the actual bank records showing the money being diverted to her personal accounts. I had the private investigators' logs of her late-night visits to casinos and high-end jewelry stores where she traded our parents' future for temporary status symbols. I was the only person in the world who knew the full extent of the Sterling family's bankruptcy. Not just the financial kind, but the moral kind that had started the day they threw coffee at my feet. I lived in a state of constant, quiet readiness, my hands steady and my mind sharp, knowing that the unethical behavior Chloe had once accused me of was actually the very thing she had turned into an art form. The contrast between my secret arsenal and the public image of the Sterling family was a source of private, bitter amusement. My mother continued to post photos of their perfect life, unaware that the pearls around her neck were likely bought with money Chloe had diverted from her own healthcare fund. My father continued to boast about his successful younger daughter at the country club, while the very foundation of his retirement was being liquidated by the woman sitting across from him at dinner. They were living in a fantasy world constructed of lies and expensive wallpaper, while I was living in the cold, hard reality of the truth. I didn't need their validation anymore. I had the $1.4 million contract and the board certifications to prove my worth. I had become the legend I promised myself I would be in that 24-hour diner, a woman whose success was a fortress that no one could breach. Every time I scrubbed in for a surgery, I felt the weight of the safe key around my neck, hidden beneath my scrubs. It was a reminder that I held the power of two different kinds of life and death. In the OR, I controlled the physical survival of my patients. In my safe, I controlled the social and emotional survival of the people who had discarded me. I was a ghost because they had made me one, but a ghost with a scalpel and a mountain of evidence is a formidable thing. I didn't want revenge in the form of a petty argument. I wanted the kind of total systemic collapse that only occurs when the truth is finally allowed to breathe. I was the silent partner in their destruction, the architect of a reckoning that was 5 years in the making. The technical specifications of my life were now a testament to my victory. I owned a 2024 midnight black Porsche Taycan, a vehicle that whispered of speed and precision, and I lived in a space where the temperature never dropped below 72 degrees. My scrubs were no longer $12 polyblends. They were custom-tailored antimicrobial fabrics that felt like silk against my skin. I was the Chief of Neurosurgery, a title that commanded respect in every room I entered. And yet, the most important thing I owned was still that paper napkin from the Silver Star Diner, tucked away in the back of my safe. It was the original Phase 1 plan, the spark that had ignited the fire that was now consuming the sterling legacy. I was no longer a daughter, and I was no longer a victim. I was a legend in the making, and the mountain of evidence in my office was the monument I was building to the truth. As I moved through the hospital halls, my footsteps echoing on the polished linoleum, I knew that the day of the incision was drawing closer. I could feel the tension in the air, the way the universe was alignment for the final confrontation. Chloe's glioblastoma was a biological event, but her financial crimes were a moral one, and the two were about to collide in my operating room. I was ready. I had the skills, I had the money, and most importantly, I had the proof. The ghost was about to become very, very visible, and the scalpel was about to cut much deeper than just skin and bone. The Sterling Medical Group was a reality. The $1.4 million salary was in the bank, and the $214,000 embezzlement was documented down to the last cent. The arsenal was complete, and the war was finally, inevitably, about to begin. The trap finally snapped shut on June 22nd, 2024, the night of my father's 65th birthday gala, an event of such performative opulence that it could only have taken place in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel on East 61st Street in Manhattan. The air in the room was thick with the scent of 500 stems of white Casablanca lilies and the metallic, ozone-tinged chill of the industrial-grade air conditioning units working to offset the heat of 120 guests in formal attire. The catering bill alone was $15,000, a lavish spread of beluga caviar and Wagyu beef sliders that felt like an insult to the memory of the 90-cent noodles I had survived on for years. At the center of the room, under a crystal chandelier that cost more than a suburban home, Chloe stood center stage, draped in a shimmering gold Vera Wang gown that made her look like a saint in a cathedral of greed. My father had just finished a speech, his voice booming with a martini-soaked vibrato as he toasted her as the savior of the family, claiming her business acumen had secured their future during a turbulent fiscal year. It was a masterpiece of fiction, a narrative built on the very foundation of the $214,000 she had siphoned from his own blood-earned retirement fund. I chose my moment with the clinical precision of a neurosurgeon approaching a delicate brainstem resection. I walked through the heavy gilded doors at exactly 8:42 p.m., the timing calculated to coincide with the post-toast silence when the collective attention of the room was at its peak. I was no longer the girl in the $40 thrift store dress or the $12 generic scrubs. I was wearing a $4,500 charcoal gray Armani Privé suit, tailored so perfectly it felt like a second skin, and my hair was pulled back into a severe professional knot that highlighted the cold, unyielding lines of my face. The room went silent, as if someone had sucked the oxygen out of the air, the collective intake of breath sounding like a distant wave hitting the shore. My mother, Beatrice, who was standing near the cake with a freshly refilled glass of gin, froze mid-sip. Her hand began to tremble, and the heavy Waterford crystal glass slipped from her manicured fingers, shattering on the white marble floor with a violent crystalline explosion that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Chloe, ever the opportunist, tried to regain control of the room by leaning into the microphone, her face contorting into a sneer that didn't quite reach her panicked eyes. "Security will escort the failure out now," she barked, her voice cracking slightly under the weight of the gold-plated lie she was living. I didn't move an inch. I stood my ground in the center of the marble foyer, the light from the chandeliers glinting off the polished surface of my leather heels. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't show a flicker of the rage that had been simmering in my marrow since 2019. Instead, I simply reached into my briefcase and held up a single, unassuming blue manila folder. It was a modest object in a room full of silk and diamonds, but inside that folder lay the calculated destruction of everything they thought they knew. The hyper-realism of the moment was staggering. I could see the individual beads of sweat forming on my father's forehead as he stared at me, his face transitioning from confusion to a deep, primal recognition of the daughter he had discarded. He looked older than 65, the tailored suit failing to hide the way his shoulders had begun to slump under the weight of his own pride. He didn't call for security. He didn't even move. He watched as I opened the folder, the crisp sound of the paper being thumbed through, cutting through the silence of the ballroom. I began to walk toward the stage, my footsteps sounding like the ticking of a countdown clock on the marble floor. I passed my mother, who was staring at the shards of her broken glass as if they were the ruins of her life, and I didn't offer her a single glance of pity. She had chosen the gin and the golden child, and now she would have to choose how to handle the fallout. As I reached the edge of the stage, I looked up at Chloe. Up close, her expensive makeup couldn't hide the sallow tint of her skin or the way her pupils were dilated with the terror of a cornered animal. She knew what was in that folder. She knew about the private investigator, the $5,000 retainer, and the mountain of bank statements that documented her $214,000 betrayal. I placed the folder on the edge of the podium, right next to the microphone she had just used to call me a failure. I didn't whisper, and I didn't shout. I spoke with the calm, authoritative tone I used when explaining a terminal prognosis to a patient's family. I told them that the savior of the family was actually the architect of its bankruptcy. I invited my father to look at page 12, where his forged signature appeared on 3 separate wire transfers to a high-stakes gambling account in Atlantic City. I invited the guests to look at the line items for the $1,100 BMW X7 lease that had been paid directly out of the account Richard had set aside for his long-term medical care. The reaction was not the explosive argument I had once dreamed of in my basement apartment. It was a slow, agonizing realization that rippled through the room like a cold front. My father reached for the folder, his hands shaking so violently that he nearly dropped it, and as he began to read, the color drained from his face until he was the same shade as the lilies on the tables. The people who had just been cheering for Chloe's business success began to step back, creating a physical gap between the stage and the audience, leaving her isolated in her gold dress. The $3,000 decorative fern in their Greenwich house couldn't save them now, and neither could the status they had built on the bones of my reputation. I stood there, a ghost who had finally taken on solid form, watching as the lies they had nurtured for 5 years were incinerated by the cold, hard data of the truth. The technical specifications of the betrayal were laid out in black and white. The dates, the times, the IP addresses used for the digital forgeries, and the exact dollar amounts that had been stolen. I had even included a copy of my own $1.4 million surgical contract at the very back of the folder, not as a boast, but as a final definitive statement of who the real success in the family was. I wanted them to see that while they were being robbed by the daughter they loved, they were being saved by the daughter they hated. The irony was a physical presence in the room, thicker than the smell of the lilies. I watched as my father looked up from the papers, his eyes finding Chloe's. And for the first time in her life, she had no marketing pitch, no lie, and no charming smile to save her. She was just a woman in an expensive dress who had been caught red-handed. The ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, with its $15,000 catering and its elite guest list, had become the site of a public autopsy. I had dissected their reality with the same precision I used in the OR, removing the malignant falsehoods and leaving the raw, bleeding truth exposed for everyone to see. I thought about the gas station coffee at my feet in 2019 and the $84,000 bill I had been forced to pay, and I realized that the debt was now fully settled. I didn't need to say another word. I turned away from the stage, my Armani suit catching the light, and I walked back toward the gilded doors. I heard my father's voice break as he whispered her name, a sound of profound, world-ending grief. But I didn't stop. I had spent 5 years being the ghost, and now I was walking out into the night as the only person in that room who was truly free. Outside, the air on 61st Street was crisp and clear, the city lights reflecting off the hood of my 2024 Porsche Taycan. I got into the car, the leather seat familiar and supportive, and I sat there for a moment in the silence of the cabin. The trap had snapped shut, the incision had been made, and the Sterling family legacy was in ruins on the floor of the Pierre. I shifted the car into gear and pulled away from the curb, leaving the lilies and the broken Waterford glass behind me. I was Dr. Madison Sterling, Chief of Neurosurgery, and I had finally closed the case on my past. The drive back to my loft in Soho was peaceful, the hum of the electric motor a soothing contrast to the chaos I had left in my wake. I knew that tomorrow I would be back in the OR, back in the world of biology and bone, but for tonight, I was just a woman who had finally cleared her name. The hyper-realism of the evening lingered in my mind. The sound of the glass shattering, the smell of my mother's gin, the look of absolute ruin on my father's face. These were the details of my victory, the specific, granular moments that confirmed I had won. I had replaced their decorative fern with the cold, hard truth, and I had shown them that a daughter's worth is not something that can be decided at a dinner table or a birthday gala. It is something built in the silence, in the cold, and in the relentless pursuit of excellence. As I parked my car and walked up to my loft, I felt a sense of closure that no amount of money or status could provide. The blue manila folder had done its work, and the legend I had promised myself I would become was now the only reality that mattered. I had survived the Sterling family, and in doing so, I had become something they could never touch. The trap was empty, and I was finally, irrevocably, home. The trap finally snapped shut on June 22nd, 2024, during the orchestrated grandeur of my father's 65th birthday gala, an event of such performative opulence that it could only have taken place in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel on East 61st Street in Manhattan. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of 500 stems of white Casablanca lilies and the metallic, ozone-tinged chill of the industrial-grade air conditioning units working to offset the heat of 120 guests in formal attire. The catering bill alone was a staggering $15,000, a lavish spread featuring beluga caviar and Wagyu beef sliders that felt like a direct insult to the memory of the 90-cent instant noodles I had survived on for years in my basement apartment. At the center of the room, positioned directly under a crystal chandelier that cost more than a suburban home, Chloe stood center stage, draped in a shimmering gold Vera Wang gown that caught every glint of light, making her look like a saint in a cathedral built of greed. My father had just finished a speech, his voice booming with a martini-soaked vibrato as he toasted her as the savior of the family, claiming her supposed business acumen had secured their future during a turbulent fiscal year. A masterpiece of fiction built on the foundation of the $214,000 she had actually siphoned from his own blood-earned retirement fund. I chose my moment with the clinical precision of a neurosurgeon approaching a delicate brainstem resection, walking through the heavy gilded doors at exactly 8:42 p.m. to ensure the timing coincided with the post-toast silence when the collective attention of the room was at its absolute peak. I was no longer the girl in the $40 thrift store dress or the $12 generic scrubs. I was wearing a $4,500 charcoal gray Armani Privé suit, tailored so perfectly it felt like a second skin, with my hair pulled back into a severe professional knot that highlighted the cold, unyielding lines of my face. The room went silent, as if someone had sucked the oxygen out of the air, the collective intake of breath sounding like a distant wave hitting the shore before a storm. My mother, Beatrice, who was standing near the tiered cake with a freshly refilled glass of botanical gin, froze mid-sip, her hand beginning to tremble so violently that the heavy Waterford crystal glass slipped from her manicured fingers and shattered on the white marble floor with a violent crystalline explosion that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Chloe, ever the opportunist, tried to regain control of the narrative by leaning into the silver microphone, her face contorting into a sneer that didn't quite reach her panicked eyes, which were darting toward the exits. "Security will escort the failure out now," she barked into the speakers, her voice cracking slightly under the weight of the gold-plated lie she was living. But I didn't move an inch from my position in the center of the marble foyer. I stood my ground, the light from the chandeliers glinting off the polished surface of my high-end leather heels, and I didn't raise my voice or show a flicker of the rage that had been simmering in my marrow since the day of the gas station coffee. Instead, I simply reached into my briefcase and held up a single, unassuming blue manila folder, a modest object in a room full of silk and diamonds, but one that contained the calculated destruction of everything they thought they knew about their golden child. The hyper-realism of the moment was staggering as I watched the individual beads of sweat form on my father's forehead while he stared at me, his face transitioning from confusion to a deep, primal recognition of the daughter he had discarded like a bad investment. He looked older than 65, the tailored suit failing to hide the way his shoulders had begun to slump under the weight of his own misplaced pride, and he didn't call for security because he was paralyzed by the sight of the woman I had become. I began to walk toward the stage, my footsteps sounding like the ticking of a countdown clock on the marble floor, passing my mother who was staring at the shards of her broken glass as if they were the literal ruins of her life. I didn't offer her a single glance of pity or a moment of acknowledgement because she had chosen the gin and the curated image over the truth, and now she would have to navigate the fallout alone. As I reached the edge of the stage, the proximity allowed me to see that Chloe's expensive makeup couldn't hide the sallow tint of her skin or the way her pupils were dilated with the terror of a cornered animal who knows the trap has finally closed. She knew exactly what was in that blue folder, recognizing the ghost of the private investigator I had hired and the mountain of bank statements that documented her $214,000 betrayal. I placed the folder on the edge of the mahogany podium, right next to the microphone she had just used to call me a failure, and I spoke with the calm, authoritative tone I used when explaining a terminal prognosis to a patient's family. I invited my father to look at page 12, where his forged signature appeared on 3 separate wire transfers to a high-stakes gambling account, and I invited the guests to see the line items for the $1,100 BMW X7 lease that had been paid directly out of his medical emergency fund. The reaction was not the explosive argument I had once dreamed of in my basement apartment, but rather a slow, agonizing realization that rippled through the room like a cold front, leaving everyone frozen in their tracks. My father reached for the folder, his hands shaking so violently that he nearly dropped it, and as he began to read the cold, hard data of his favorite daughter's theft, the color drained from his face until he was the same shade as the lilies decorating the tables. The people who had just been cheering for Chloe's business success began to step back instinctively, creating a physical gap between the stage and the audience, leaving her isolated in her gold dress like a specimen under a microscope. The $3,000 decorative fern in their Greenwich house couldn't save them now, and neither could the status they had built on the bones of my reputation, because I had brought the truth into the room, and it was undeniable. I stood there, a ghost who had finally taken on solid, indestructible form, watching as the lies they had nurtured for 5 years were incinerated by the evidence I had meticulously gathered. The technical specifications of the betrayal were laid out in black and white, including the dates, the times, and the specific IP addresses used for the digital forgeries that Chloe had thought were untraceable. I had even included a copy of my own $1.4 million surgical contract at the very back of the folder, not as a boast, but as a final definitive statement of who had truly succeeded in the face of their rejection. I wanted them to see that while they were being systematically robbed by the daughter they adored, they were being technically saved by the daughter they had treated as a drain on their resources. The irony was a physical presence in the room, thicker than the smell of the lilies or the expensive catering, and I watched as my father looked up from the papers, his eyes finding Chloe's in a moment of profound, world-ending grief. For the first time in her life, Chloe had no marketing pitch, no lie, and no charming smile to save her from the consequences of her own actions. She was just a woman in an expensive dress who had been caught red-handed in front of everyone who mattered to her. The ballroom of the Pierre Hotel had become the site of a public autopsy, and I had dissected their reality with the same precision I used in the OR, removing the malignant falsehoods and leaving the raw, bleeding truth exposed. I thought about the splash of the gas station coffee in 2019 and the $84,000 bill I had been forced to pay, and I realized that the debt was now fully settled, with interest. I didn't need to say another word to any of them, so I turned away from the stage, my Armani suit catching the light of the chandeliers as I walked back toward the gilded doors. I heard my father's voice break as he whispered her name, a sound of absolute ruin. But I didn't stop or look back because I had spent 5 years being the ghost, and now I was walking out into the night as the only person in that room who was truly free. Outside, the air on 61st Street was crisp and clear, the city lights reflecting off the midnight black hood of my 2024 Porsche Taycan, which waited at the curb like a silent witness to my triumph. I got into the car, the leather seat familiar and supportive, and I sat there for a moment in the silence of the high-tech cabin, feeling the weight of the evening settle into a sense of profound peace. The trap had snapped shut, the incision had been made, and the Sterling family legacy was in ruins on the floor of the Pierre, exactly as I had planned in the Silver Star Diner years ago. I shifted the car into gear and pulled away from the curb, leaving the lilies, the broken Waterford glass, and the shattered lies behind me in the rearview mirror. I was Dr. Madison Sterling, Chief of Neurosurgery, and I had finally closed the case on my past by becoming the legend they never believed I could be. The drive back to my minimalist loft in Soho was peaceful, the hum of the electric motor a soothing contrast to the chaos I had just unleashed, and I knew that tomorrow I would be back in the OR, back in the world of biology and bone, where the truth is the only thing that matters. The hyper-realism of the evening lingered in my mind as a series of sharp, granular moments. The sound of the glass, the smell of the gin, the look of ruin, all confirming that I had replaced their decorative fern with a reality they could never ignore. I had survived the Sterling family, and in doing so, I had built a life that was finally, irrevocably, my own. The aftermath of that night at the Pierre Hotel was absolute and unforgiving. A total systemic collapse of the Sterling family's carefully constructed facade that played out with the cold, unyielding momentum of a landslide. Chloe is currently facing multiple felony embezzlement charges, her name no longer associated with marketing success, but with a court docket and a $150,000 civil suit filed by my father in a desperate, frantic attempt to claw back the remains of his vanishing legacy. The gold Vera Wang gown and the 3-carat diamond ring have been replaced by legal fees and the sharp, fluorescent reality of a public defender's office, as the luxury she built on the ruins of my life proved to be as fragile as a house of cards in a hurricane. My parents, the people who once defined their worth by the manicured hedges of their $1.2 million Greenwich Colonial, were forced to sell the estate at a loss to settle the debts Chloe had accrued in their names. They now live in a cramped, $1,200 a month rental in a forgotten corner of Bridgeport, a place where the walls are thin enough to hear the neighbors' televisions and the air smells of old cooking grease and regret. The contrast is a haunting echo of my years in the Astoria basement, a poetic justice that I observe with a clinical detachment from the heights of my own success. Over the last few months, my inbox has been flooded with 14 separate emails from my mother and father, each one more desperate and pathetic than the last, filled with pleas for family forgiveness and invitations to dinners I will never attend. They write about how blood is thicker than water and how they were misled, their words smelling of the same expensive gin and hubris that led them to discard me in a gas station parking lot 5 years ago. I waited until the 14th email arrived, a sprawling 5-page lamentation from my father about the loneliness of their new apartment, before I finally sat down at my custom-built walnut desk in my penthouse. I didn't type a long-winded explanation or a list of my grievances because the time for dialogue had long since passed. Instead, I attached a single high-resolution PDF of the $84,200 receipt from the bank transfer I had made in 2019, the document that represented every cent they had ever invested in me, paid back with meticulous interest. Below the attachment, I typed a single final sentence that felt like the closing of a surgical wound. The debt is settled. The daughter is dead. I hit send, and then I blocked their addresses, permanently severing the last digital thread that connected me to the people who shared my DNA, but never my heart. Now, I live in a 34th floor penthouse with a panoramic view of Central Park, a space defined by floor-to-ceiling glass, Italian marble, and a level of silence that is as profound as it is expensive. The only thing I hear when I come home from a 12-hour shift at the hospital is the quiet hum of the climate control system and the absolute, unadulterated silence of my own peace. I am no longer a drain on anyone's retirement fund, nor am I a dropout or a failure. I am Dr. Madison Sterling, the woman who built a kingdom out of the ashes of a betrayal. My surgical hands, once splattered with gas station coffee, are now the most trusted tools in the city, and my bank balance is a fortress that no one can breach. I look out over the city lights as they begin to flicker on in the twilight, reflecting off the dark surface of the reservoir, and I feel a sense of completion that is entirely independent of my family's recognition. They wanted to erase me, but in doing so, they provided the vacuum I needed to expand into a legend. The hyper-realism of my current existence is a testament to the fact that family is not a biological obligation, but a privilege that must be earned through loyalty and truth. The $84,000 receipt sits in my safe alongside the evidence of Chloe's crimes, a twin set of documents that tell the story of a girl who was cast out and a woman who chose herself. My father's 2018 silver metallic BMW is long gone, replaced by a repossession notice, while my 2024 Porsche Taycan sits in a climate-controlled garage, ready to carry me toward a future they will never be a part of. The $3,000 decorative fern in their old house has likely withered in the care of whatever new owner bought the colonial, much like the relationship I once tried so hard to save. I have realized that boundaries are not just walls meant to keep people out. They are the foundations upon which a healthy life is built, and I have built mine out of reinforced steel and surgical-grade integrity. As I pour myself a glass of vintage Cabernet and sit on my terrace, watching the sunset bleed into the Manhattan skyline, I think about the girl in the $40 thrift store dress standing in the rain. I want to tell her that the damp upholstery of her rusting Corolla was the smell of her impending freedom, and that every 90-cent meal was a down payment on this penthouse view. I want her to know that the silence of this park at night is the most beautiful music she will ever hear. My name is Dr. Madison Sterling, and I am 34 years old. I am a chief neurosurgeon, a self-made millionaire, and a woman who finally understands that the most important surgery I ever performed was the one where I cut out the toxicity of my own bloodline to save my own soul. The Sterling legacy is no longer a story of manufacturing plants and Greenwich mansions. It is a story of a single woman who refused to be a casualty of someone else's lie. The legal proceedings against Chloe are expected to last for years, a slow-motion dissection of her character that will be documented in public records for anyone to see. My parents will spend the rest of their lives in that Bridgeport rental, staring at the walls and wondering how the golden child they worshipped became the person who bankrupted them. They will look at the news and see my face when I am awarded the next medical breakthrough prize, and they will know that they have no claim to my glory. They will remember the day at the gas station and the night at the Pierre, and they will realize that they didn't just lose a daughter. They lost the only person who was ever actually real in their world. I don't feel anger toward them anymore, just a profound, clinical indifference. They are patients I couldn't save, a pathology that was too deep to treat, and I have moved on to the next case. My home is a sanctuary of my own making, filled with books that are actually read, art that was bought with my own labor, and a quietude that is the ultimate luxury. I have found my own family in the nurses I work with, the residents I mentor, and the patients who wake up from surgery and see my face as the first thing they recognize. We are bound not by DNA, but by the shared experience of the OR and the mutual respect of people who do the work. I am finally, irrevocably, at home in my own skin. The debt is settled, the truth is out, and the daughter who was discarded has become the legend who survived. This is the moral of the architecture I have built. Family isn't who you are born with, but who stays when the lights go out and the truth comes out. I have chosen to stay for myself, and that is more than enough to fill this penthouse with all the warmth I will ever need.